I know the title sounds like some clickbait crap you see on the internet, but trust me, this is as real as it gets. I've been sitting on this for a while, and it's taken me a long time to work up the nerve to share it. My best friend Jared is gone. He vanished without a trace, and the last thing I have left of him is his diary, filled with entries that haunt me to this day. I still can't sleep without seeing the things he described, and I'm hoping that by putting this out there, maybe someone can help me figure out what happened. Jared and I have been friends since we were kids. We grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same schools, and even worked the same shitty part-time jobs during high school. He was the kind of guy who was always down for whatever, and we shared everything, from our love for video games to our fascination with the internet. But things started to change when Jared got into the dark web. You know how some people say that the dark web is where you can find anything? Drugs, hitmen, stolen credit cards, you name it. Jared was obsessed with it. At first, it was just a curiosity. He'd tell me about the weird stuff he found, disturbing videos, illegal marketplaces, and forums filled with the worst kinds of people. But then, he started spending more and more time on it, diving deeper into the darkest corners of the internet, and that's when things got weird. It was around this time that Jared became more secretive. He used to be an open book, but suddenly he was locking his laptop whenever I came over, muttering excuses about why he couldn't hang out as much, and canceling plans last minute. When I asked him what was up, he'd just brush it off, saying he was working on something big, and that I'd understand soon enough. I figured he was just being weird, maybe getting into some new hobby or project, but I had no idea how bad it had gotten. Then one night, Jared called me. It was around 2 a.m., and he sounded like he was on the edge of a breakdown. He begged me to come over, saying he needed to show me something. When I got to his place, I found him in his room, pacing back and forth like a maniac. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had this wild, desperate look on his face. He handed me a notebook, his diary, and told me to read it. I hesitated. It felt wrong, like I was invading his privacy, but he insisted. "Just read it, man," he said, his voice shaky. "You need to know what's happening." So, I opened the diary. The first few entries were normal, random thoughts, plans for the future, stuff about work. But as I flipped through the pages, things started to get dark. Jared wrote about how he'd found a forum on the dark web that claimed to be a gateway to another dimension. The members of the forum were all obsessed with this idea, that they could communicate with beings from beyond our world. It sounded like some kind of cult, but Jared was completely sucked in. He described in detail how he followed their instructions, downloading weird programs, running bizarre rituals in the middle of the night, and even cutting himself to offer blood to the void, as he called it. The diary was filled with drawings of strange symbols, almost like runes, and he wrote about seeing shadows moving in the corners of his vision, hearing whispers that weren't there, and feeling a presence watching him, even when he was alone. The further I read, the more disturbed I became. Jared wrote about how he started seeing things that couldn't be real. Creatures with twisted, deformed faces staring at him from the darkness, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He described waking up in the middle of the night to find his walls covered in black, oozing slime, and his skin crawling with bugs that vanished as soon as he turned on the lights. He wrote about how he could hear voices in his head, telling him to do things, horrible things, and how he was starting to lose control. But the worst part was the last few entries. Jared wrote about a woman who started appearing in his dreams. He described her as tall, with long black hair and eyes that were pitch black, like voids. She never spoke, but she would stare at him with this intense, unnerving gaze that made him feel like she was looking into his soul. He said that every time he dreamed of her, he'd wake up with cuts and bruises on his body, like she was physically hurting him in his sleep. The last entry was scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible handwriting. Jared wrote that he couldn't take it anymore, that he was going to do whatever it took to make it stop. He mentioned a ritual, something he found on the forum, that was supposed to seal the connection and banish the entities that were tormenting him. He didn't go into detail about what the ritual involved, but he was desperate, saying he would do it that night. After I finished reading, I looked up at Jared, and he was just staring at me, his eyes hollow and empty. "I have to do it, man," he said. "It's the only way to make it stop." I didn't know what to say. I was freaked out, but I could see that Jared was on the edge of something terrible. He was shaking, his skin pale and clammy, and there was this overwhelming sense of dread in the room. I tried to convince him to let me stay with him, to maybe go get help, but he refused. He said he had to do it alone, that it was too dangerous for anyone else to be there. I left his place that night feeling sick to my stomach. I wanted to believe that it was all in his head, that he was just having a breakdown, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jared was in serious danger. The next morning, I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. I went over to his place, but his car was gone, and the door was locked. I haven't seen or heard from him since. I reported him missing to the police, but they didn't take it seriously. They just chalked it up to a grown man who probably ran off on his own. I tried to explain about the dark web stuff, the diary, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They said there was no evidence of foul play, no reason to believe Jared was in any danger, but I know what I read. I know what Jared was involved in, and I'm terrified that whatever he was trying to escape from finally got him. And the worst part? I can't get those last diary entries out of my head. They've burned themselves into my brain, and I'm starting to see the things Jared described. I hear whispers when I'm alone, see shadows out of the corner of my eye, and feel like something is watching me. I don't know what to do. I'm scared out of my mind, and I feel like I'm losing it. If anyone out there has experienced something similar, or knows anything about what Jared was involved in, please, I need your help. I'm afraid that whatever took Jared is coming for me next. All right, so after that night, I couldn't get Jared's diary out of my head. It's like the words were etched into my mind, and no matter how hard I tried to push them away, they kept creeping back in. I started having nightmares, vivid, gut-wrenching dreams that left me drenched in sweat, gasping for breath in the middle of the night. In these dreams, I was in Jared's room, surrounded by those same disturbing symbols he'd drawn in his diary. They were everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, even on the floor. And then there was the woman, the one Jared described, with her long black hair and those goddamn pitch-black eyes. She'd be standing in the corner of the room, just staring at me, her mouth twisted into this eerie, knowing smile. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but watch as she slowly walked toward me, her eyes locked onto mine. And then, just as she'd reach out to touch me, I'd wake up, my heart pounding so hard, it felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Every time, I'd find myself in a cold sweat, my sheets soaked and twisted around me like a straitjacket. I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just dreams. They felt too real, too visceral, like something was actually happening to me while I slept. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever had happened to Jared to happen to me. So, I decided to go back to his place. Maybe there was something there, some clue, anything that could help me understand what the hell was going on. When I got to Jared's house, it was eerily quiet. The blinds were drawn, and the place had this abandoned vibe that set my nerves on edge. I half expected to see Jared's car in the driveway, but it was still gone, just like it had been the last time I was there. I didn't have a key, but I knew where Jared kept his spare, taped to the inside of the mailbox. I grabbed it and let myself in, the door creaking ominously as it swung open. The house smelled stale, like no one had been there for days. Dust hung in the air, catching the light that filtered in through the gaps in the blinds. Jared's room was the same as I'd left it, except for one thing. The diary was gone. I could have sworn I left it on his desk, but now the desk was empty, the surface bare except for a few stray papers. Panic surged through me. Had someone been here? Had Jared come back? I started tearing through the room, searching for the diary or any sign of Jared, but it was like he'd vanished without a trace. The more I searched, the more frantic I became, until I found myself standing in the middle of the room, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. That's when I noticed it. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness inside. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was all I could focus on. My heart started pounding again, that same intense, suffocating feeling of dread settling over me. I walked toward the closet, each step feeling like I was wading through thick, invisible mud. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and get the hell out of there, but I couldn't. Something was drawing me in, pulling me closer, and before I knew it, I was opening the door. Inside the closet, I found something I wasn't expecting, an old, beat-up laptop. It was covered in dust, but when I wiped it off, I realized it was Jared's, the same laptop he'd been so secretive about in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. My hands were shaking as I opened it, the screen flickering to life with a low hum. The desktop was almost empty, just a few folders with cryptic names. But what caught my attention was the program that was already open, some kind of messaging app I'd never seen before. The screen was filled with a long string of messages, and at the top was Jared's username, along with a bunch of others that were nothing but random letters and numbers. I scrolled through the messages, my stomach twisting with every line I read. Jared had been talking to these people, these things, about the rituals, about the woman from his dreams, and about something they called the transition. The conversation was filled with bizarre instructions, warnings, and cryptic references to the other side, but it was the last few messages that made my blood run cold. Jared had written about how the woman was no longer just in his dreams. He said she was starting to appear during the day, in reflections, in shadows, always watching him, always smiling. He was terrified, desperate to escape, and that's when the others started encouraging him to perform the final ritual. The last message from Jared was short, almost incoherent. "She's here. I can't stop her. I have to do it. Goodbye." And that was it. No response from the others, nothing. Just a blank screen, like they knew he was gone. I sat there, staring at the screen, my mind racing. Jared had been sucked into something far worse than I could have ever imagined. Whatever he had been communicating with, whatever he had invited into his life, it was real. And now, it was coming for me. As I sat there, I started to feel that same oppressive presence Jared had described. The air in the room grew heavy, like it was being sucked out, and the temperature dropped so fast that my breath turned to mist. I could feel her before I saw her. That same woman from the dreams, from Jared's diary. She was standing in the corner of the room, her eyes boring into mine, her smile wider than before, like she was savoring my fear. I bolted out of that room so fast, I nearly tripped over myself. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I sat there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest, as I tried to process what I had just seen. I knew I couldn't stay at Jared's place, but I also knew I couldn't go back to mine. Not with the way things were escalating. I felt like I was being hunted, like whatever had taken Jared was closing in on me, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up. I drove to the only place I could think of, my parents' house, about an hour away. They were out of town for the weekend, so I had the place to myself. I locked all the doors, drew all the blinds, and tried to calm down. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that she had followed me. The worst part was that when I closed my eyes, I could still see her, standing in the corner, watching, waiting. I could still feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. I haven't slept in days. Every time I try and the nightmares start up again, and I wake up with new bruises, new cuts, like she's marking me, claiming me as hers. I'm at my breaking point, and I don't know how much longer I can hold out. I'm scared, more scared than I've ever been in my life. I know that whatever took Jared is coming for me, and I don't know how to stop it. I've been thinking about that final ritual Jared mentioned, the one he was supposed to do to seal the connection. Maybe that's the only way to make this stop, to protect myself from whatever's coming. But I don't even know where to start. I don't know what the ritual involves, what it requires, and the thought of trying to follow in Jared's footsteps, of going down the same path that led to his disappearance, it terrifies me. But I'm running out of options. The more I resist, the more she pushes. The more she invades my mind, my dreams, my reality. I'm starting to understand why Jared was so desperate, why he felt like he had no choice. I'm scared to even say it out loud, but I think I might have to try. I might have to do the ritual, whatever it takes, before it's too late, before she takes me too. All right, so I've been holding off on writing this part for a bit because honestly, I'm scared. Scared of what I'm about to do and scared of what might happen if it doesn't work. But things have gotten worse, much worse, since I last posted. And I don't have the luxury of time anymore. I can't keep running, can't keep hiding. She's getting stronger, more relentless, and I'm barely holding it together. After I left Jared's place, I spent a few days holed up at my parents' house, trying to figure out my next move. I searched online, trying to find anything, any clue, any reference to what Jared had gotten himself into. But everything I found was either too vague or too bizarre to make sense of. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle where most of the pieces were missing. But then, something strange happened. I was going through some old boxes in the basement, looking for anything that might distract me, when I found an old journal. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my parents', but something about it seemed familiar. When I opened it, I realized it was Jared's, another one of his diaries, one I'd never seen before. The pages were yellowed with age, and the writing was more erratic than in the diary I found at his place. The entries were dated years ago, back when we were still in high school. I had no idea he'd been keeping this journal for so long. But as I read through it, I realized that Jared's obsession with the dark web and the occult had started way earlier than I thought. He wrote about how he had stumbled upon something called the Red Room, a notorious dark website where you could supposedly watch people get tortured and killed in real time. Most people thought it was an urban legend, a sick internet myth, but Jared had convinced himself it was real. He became obsessed with finding it, convinced that it held the key to unlocking some kind of hidden truth about the world. The deeper he went, the more disturbing his entries became. He wrote about seeing things that couldn't be real, faces in the static of his TV, whispers coming from his computer speakers, and that same woman with the black eyes appearing in his dreams. But what really shook me was an entry from a few weeks before the diary I found in his room. In it, he mentioned the ritual, the same one he'd written about in his final entries. Jared described the ritual in terrifying detail. It was called the Binding, and it was supposed to be a way to sever the connection between our world and whatever was trying to break through. The instructions were complex, involving a mix of ancient symbols, specific incantations, and, most disturbingly, blood. Jared wrote that the ritual had to be performed at a specific time during the witching hour, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. He was convinced that this was the only way to protect himself, to keep the entities from crossing over. But he also wrote about how dangerous it was, how it could backfire if not done perfectly, and how it could leave the person performing it vulnerable to the very forces they were trying to repel. Reading that made me sick to my stomach. Jared had tried to do this, and it hadn't worked. He'd disappeared, and now, whatever was after him was coming for me. But what choice did I have? I was out of options. I couldn't go to the police, couldn't tell anyone without sounding insane, and every day that passed, the situation got worse. So, I decided to do it. I figured that if I could follow the instructions to the letter, maybe, just maybe, I could succeed where Jared had failed. The night I decided to perform the ritual was one of the darkest nights I've ever experienced. The sky was a deep, oppressive black, with no stars, no moon, just an endless void that seemed to swallow all light. I set up everything in my parents' basement, which felt like the safest place to do it. The air down there was musty, and the old concrete walls made it feel like a tomb, a fitting place for what I was about to attempt. I drew the symbols Jared had described on the floor using chalk, ancient runes that made no sense to me, but which he'd insisted were crucial. The shapes were intricate, almost alive, and as I traced each one, I could feel a strange energy pulsing through the lines. Next, I lit the candles. 6 of them, arranged in a precise pattern around the symbols. Their flickering light cast long, twisted shadows that danced on the walls like they were alive. Then came the incantations. Jared had written them phonetically, which was a relief because there was no way I could have pronounced those words otherwise. The language was harsh, guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. As I spoke the words, the air around me seemed to vibrate, like the sound was distorting reality itself. Finally, the part I'd been dreading, the blood. Jared had been clear that this was a blood ritual, that my blood was the key to sealing the connection. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and then sliced my palm with a knife. The pain was sharp, immediate, and blood welled up, dripping onto the floor. I let it fall onto the center of the largest symbol, watching as it pooled and spread, filling the grooves like it had a mind of its own. The moment my blood touched the symbol, the entire room seemed to shift. The shadows on the walls grew darker, more defined, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath again, misting in the cold air, but it wasn't just cold, it was freezing, like the warmth was being sucked out of the room by some unseen force. And then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, like the wind passing through cracks in the walls. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once in that same harsh, guttural language. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, rage, hunger. The candles flickered wildly, the flames stretching and contorting, casting grotesque shapes on the walls. And then, from the darkness, she appeared. The woman from Jared's dreams, from my nightmares. But this time, she was different. She wasn't just a shadow, a figment of my imagination. She was real, standing in front of me, her eyes those same empty voids, her smile a twisted, cruel thing that made my blood run cold. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched me with those dark, unblinking eyes. I could feel her presence, like a physical weight pressing down on me, crushing me. The voices grew louder, more frantic, and the shadows began to move, swirling around her like a storm. I tried to keep my focus, tried to complete the ritual, but the fear was overwhelming. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst, my hands trembling so violently, I could barely hold the knife. I forced myself to continue, to speak the final incantation, to draw the final symbol in my blood, but every word felt like it was being ripped from my throat. As I finished the last word, there was a moment of absolute silence, like the entire world had been sucked into a vacuum. And then, everything exploded. The shadows surged forward, engulfing me, and the woman, she was right in front of me, her face inches from mine, her breath cold against my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness was all-consuming, swallowing me whole, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was her smile, growing wider, impossibly wide, as if she was devouring my soul. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the basement, the candles extinguished, the symbols smeared and incomplete. My head was pounding, my body aching, and my hand, where I'd cut it, was wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth. I had no memory of what had happened after the darkness took me, but I could feel that something had changed. The air was heavy with a strange, oppressive energy, like the room itself was alive, watching me. And then I realized she was gone. The presence, the whispers, the shadows, they were all gone. But I wasn't relieved. If anything, I was more terrified than ever because I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Jared had tried to stop her, and he had failed. I had tried to seal the connection, and maybe I had, but I had no way of knowing for sure. All I knew was that she wasn't gone. She was still out there, waiting, watching, and it was only a matter of time before she came back. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The ritual might have bought me some time, but it didn't stop her. I can feel her, just beyond the edges of my consciousness, like a shadow lurking in the corner of my eye. And every day, every hour, she's getting closer. I'm scared, more scared than I've ever been in my life. But I'm not giving up. I have to find a way to stop her, to end this before it's too late, for Jared, for myself, for anyone else who might get caught up in this nightmare. But the truth is, I'm running out of time, and I'm starting to wonder if there's any way out of this at all. I haven't been able to shake this feeling of dread that's been gnawing at me ever since I tried that ritual. The silence in my head, where the whispers once were, isn't the relief I thought it would be. It's more like the calm before a storm, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl because you know something is coming, something worse. I've been sleeping with the lights on, every bulb in the house burning bright, hoping that the light would keep the shadows at bay. But even then, I haven't been able to sleep much. Every time I close my eyes, I feel like she's there, just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. The ritual might have stopped her from physically manifesting, but I know she's still here, somewhere, lurking. I've been trying to piece together everything Jared knew, everything he was too far gone to tell me before he disappeared. I've spent hours poring over every scrap of information I could find on the dark web, searching through forums and message boards that make my skin crawl just looking at them. I've found other people, other victims who've encountered similar entities, though none quite like her. Most of the accounts are the same. Someone stumbles upon something they shouldn't have. They start seeing things, hearing things, and eventually, they vanish. No trace left behind, no closure for their families or friends, just gone. But there was one account that stood out to me, something that sent a shiver down my spine the moment I read it. It was buried deep in a thread on a forum dedicated to occult practices. The post was from years ago, written by someone going by the username Mortalize. He described a woman much like the one Jared and I had seen, a tall figure with long black hair and those pitch black eyes that seemed to swallow the light. He called her the Collector. According to Mortalize, the Collector was a kind of parasitic entity, feeding off the fear and despair of her victims. She would latch on to someone, slowly driving them mad, until they were so desperate that they'd do anything to escape. That's when she'd strike, dragging them into her domain, what he called the Void. It wasn't just death she was after. She wanted something more, something that made my blood run cold when I read it. She wanted their souls. The idea of souls, of some part of us existing beyond death, had always seemed like bullshit to me. But after everything I've seen, I'm not so sure anymore. According to the post, once she has you, you're trapped, stuck in this hellish limbo where she can feed on your essence for eternity. The more fear you feel, the stronger she gets, and the harder it is to escape. Mortalize claimed that the only way to break free was to confront her directly, to face her in the void, and sever her connection to this world. But here's the kicker. No one who tried had ever come back. The few who managed to survive the initial encounter were too broken, too terrified to even attempt it. And those who did try, they just, disappeared. I know how insane this sounds, believe me. If I hadn't seen what I've seen, I'd dismiss it as the ramblings of a lunatic. But the more I think about it, the more it makes sense. Jared wasn't just trying to escape her. He was trying to find a way to fight back, to stop her before she could drag him into the void. That's why he was so desperate, why he was willing to do anything to break free. And now, I'm the one in her sights. I can feel her closing in, every day, every hour. It's like she's testing me, pushing me to see how far I'll go to avoid the inevitable. The dreams are getting worse, more vivid, more real. I see her face every time I close my eyes. That twisted smile, those empty eyes that seem to see right through me. I wake up gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard, it feels like it's going to explode out of my chest. And the worst part? I'm starting to lose track of what's real and what's not. I see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that move when they shouldn't, reflections in mirrors that don't match my movements, flickers of darkness in the brightest rooms. I hear faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing, like someone is speaking to me from far away. It's getting harder and harder to tell if it's just my imagination, or if she's really there, watching, waiting. I've tried everything to block her out. Meditation, prayer, even drugs, but nothing works. The only thing that seems to help, even a little, is writing this all down. It's like getting the words out of my head and onto the page gives me some small measure of control. But it's not enough. I know that if I don't do something soon, she's going to take me, just like she took Jared. That's why I've made a decision, one that scares the absolute shit out of me. But I don't see any other choice. I'm going to try to face her, to confront her in the void, just like Mortalize described. If Jared was right, if there's any chance of severing the connection and ending this nightmare, then I have to try. I have to believe that there's a way out, a way to fight back. I don't know what's going to happen when I do this. For all I know, it could be a suicide mission, a one-way ticket to the same fate that took Jared. But I can't keep living like this, trapped in a constant state of fear, waiting for the inevitable. I'd rather go down fighting, knowing that I at least tried to take control of my fate. I've been preparing for the confrontation, gathering everything I think I'll need. Candles, salt, the symbols Jared drew, the ones from the diary, and the knife I used in the first ritual. I've been memorizing the incantations, trying to steel myself for what's coming, but nothing can really prepare you for something like this. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you have to jump, but having no idea what's waiting for you at the bottom. Tonight's the night. I've waited long enough, and I can feel that she's getting impatient, that she's ready to make her move. I'm going back to Jared's house, to the basement where this all started. It feels right, like that's where I'm supposed to do this. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, Or maybe it's her, manipulating me, leading me to the place where she has the most power. But I don't care. I'm going to end this, one way or another. As I write this, I'm sitting in my car outside Jared's house. The sky is dark. The kind of dark that feels like it's pressing down on you, suffocating you. There's no wind, no sound, just an oppressive silence that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'm trying to keep calm, to focus on the task at hand, but my hands are shaking, my heart is racing, and I feel like I'm about to walk into my own funeral. I don't know if I'll be able to post again after this. If I succeed, maybe I'll be free. Maybe I'll be able to come back and tell you all what happened. But if I fail, then this will be the last thing I ever write. Wish me luck. I'm going to need it. If you're reading this, then somehow I've made it back. Or maybe this is just my final scream into the void. I honestly don't know anymore. Everything that's happened has twisted my sense of reality so much that I can barely tell what's real and what isn't. But I need to get this out. Need to tell you what happened, because I don't know how much time I have left. After I finished writing part 4, I sat in my car for what felt like hours, trying to gather the courage to go into Jared's house. The dark silence outside was like a thick blanket smothering me, and every instinct screamed at me to just turn the key in the ignition, drive away, and never look back. But I couldn't. This was it. My last chance to take control, to stop running, to face her. I finally forced myself to get out of the car, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. The house loomed in front of me, more like a dark shadow than a building. As I approached, the front door creaked open on its own, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, plunging me into darkness. The air inside was thick, heavy with the stench of decay and something else, something metallic, like blood. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of it. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar hallway, though it felt different now. The walls seemed to pulse, like they were alive, and the shadows, they weren't just shadows. They were watching me, waiting. I made my way down to the basement, every step feeling like it could be my last. The door to the basement was ajar, and as I pushed it open, the flashlight flickered, casting wild, erratic shadows on the stairs. I took a deep breath and descended, the air growing colder with each step, until I could see my breath hanging in the air in front of me. The basement was exactly as I had left it. The chalk symbols on the floor, the candles, the knife. But now, there was something else. In the center of the room, where I had spilled my blood during the first ritual, there was a dark, swirling vortex, a hole in reality itself. It looked like a wound in the fabric of the world, bleeding darkness into the room. The sight of it made my stomach churn, and I had to fight the urge to run. But I didn't run. I forced myself to move closer, to stand at the edge of that swirling void, and I could feel its pull, like gravity, like it was sucking me in. I knew this was it. The void that Mortal Eyes had described, the place where she waited. I could feel her presence on the other side, that same oppressive weight, the same cold, creeping dread. I took the knife, the same one I'd used before, and without hesitating, I sliced my palm again, letting the blood drip into the void. The moment it touched the darkness, the entire room shuddered, and the vortex seemed to expand, the darkness reaching out, tendrils of shadow curling around my feet, pulling me closer. And then, I fell. It was like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I tumbled into the void, the darkness swallowing me whole. There was no sense of time, no up or down. Just an endless, suffocating blackness that pressed in from all sides. My body felt weightless, and the cold was so intense, it felt like it was burning me from the inside out. Then I saw her. She wasn't just a figure in the shadows anymore. She was the shadows, the darkness itself. Her form shifting and twisting as she emerged from the void. Her eyes were the same empty voids, her smile that same cruel twist of malevolent glee. She towered over me, her presence overwhelming, her power suffocating. I was nothing compared to her, just a speck of dust in the vastness of her realm. She didn't speak, didn't need to. I could feel her intentions, her hunger, her desire to consume me, to drag me down into the depths of the void, where I would be lost forever, just another soul trapped in her endless collection. But I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I forced myself to stand, even as the darkness threatened to crush me. I remembered what Mortal Eyes had said about severing the connection. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. I began to recite the incantations, the words Jared had written in his diary, the ones meant to break her hold. As I spoke, the darkness around me seemed to recoil, the tendrils of shadow pulling back, as if the words were hurting her. Her smile faltered, her eyes narrowing with something that looked like anger or fear. But I didn't stop. I kept going, louder and louder, forcing the words out through gritted teeth, even as the shadows closed in, trying to silence me. The void began to tremble, the darkness around me churning, twisting, like it was being ripped apart. Her form began to blur, to flicker, as if she was struggling to maintain her grip on reality. I could feel the connection weakening, feel her power waning. And then, with one final word, everything exploded. The darkness shattered, fragments of shadow flying in all directions, and I was thrown backward, tumbling through the void. The cold, the pain, everything overwhelming me. I hit something hard, solid ground, and the world came rushing back, the darkness fading, the cold lifting. I was back in the basement, lying on the floor, gasping for breath. The vortex was gone, the symbols on the floor smudged, the candles snuffed out. The oppressive presence, the weight of her gaze, was gone. I was alone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. But something wasn't right. I struggled to my feet, my entire body aching, my head spinning. The basement was the same, but different. The walls were cracked, the floor uneven, like the house had been abandoned for years. Dust coated everything, and the air was stale, heavy with the scent of decay. I made my way upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. The house was empty, silent. No furniture, no signs of life, just empty rooms filled with dust and shadows. It was like no one had lived here for years, like the house had been forgotten by time itself. I stumbled out the front door, into the cold night air, but the world outside was just as strange. The street was empty, the houses dark. No lights, no cars, no signs of life. The sky was a deep, unnatural black, with no stars, no moon, just an endless void that seemed to stretch on forever. I don't know where I am. I don't know if I ever really escaped, or if this is just another part of the void, another trap set by her. All I know is that something went wrong, that I'm not in the world I knew, not in the world I came from, and the worst part, I can still feel her, just at the edge of my consciousness, waiting, watching. She's not gone. I might have severed the connection, but I didn't destroy her. She's still out there, still hungry, and I'm still her prey. So, if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, then heed my warning. Don't follow in my footsteps. Don't try to fight her, because once she's got her hooks in you, there's no escape. No matter where you go, no matter how far you run, she'll always be there, waiting in the darkness, in the void. And one day, she'll take you too.